Alright, let's get this show on the road. Wait, no, wrong one. This one. Hi. I should probably. There we go. Thanks for the follow. Yeah, so today I'll be talking about performativity in the context of sexuality. And I mean, I'll give a general overview of what performativity is more broadly, but yeah. So I have a cursor. So I'll be going through, what it is, narrowing it down onto specifically sexuality, and then I'll be looking at where it works really well in sociological research, and where it might have some shortcomings. I personally don't think there are that many big shortcomings, but I'll go through them anyway. So yeah, what is performativity? To put it simply, it's performance. That's very, very broad, but essentially performativity is a theory that builds upon a couple of the previous things and synthesizes them into one big overarching theory. So for the first component we need to understand performativity is Austin's performatives. So essentially these are like speech acts that have significance, right? That symbolize something actually happening in the world, right? So the big like pet performative that gets mentioned in Doing Things with Words by Austin is marriage, right? So for example, a minister saying, "Do you take blah 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 as your lawfully wedded husband, wife, whatever?" And the person saying, "I do." That is a performative. That's performing the act of marriage, right? And it's significant. So that's that's performatives. It's words that mean things. Next component we need to kind of understand is discursive power. So this is classic Foucault. Very interesting gentleman. Said everything's a prison, including trying to find a truth behind sexuality. So Foucault was like, sex is not real. It's all discursive power. Sexuality is created through discourse. So as people try to discuss, what is the truth behind sexuality? That is, in fact, the thing that is creating sexuality, right? So if we take these and put them together, we get to Butler's performativity. So Butler came in and was like, well, those theories make a lot of sense. What if there is no gender, sex, sexuality? It's all constructed, right? And specifically constructed through people partaking in performatives and following scripts and stuff that society kind of lays out for them. And so from there, we can tease it out a bit more. And specifically, Butler's like, okay, bodies as like a biological thing are neutral, right? And without society to ascribe meaning to the symbol, it doesn't really, have meaning. And so, therefore, sex as a category is actually just gender applied to an ungendered body. And yeah, that's pretty radical. Like, man, woman as a biological category, fake news. I mean, people nowadays kind of, at least in like sociology, there is. Ooh, thanks for the follow. there's more consensus that, like, yeah, social constructions. But yeah, I'll get more into that later. So essentially, I've put the point here on my slide. Nothing is an ontology. Everything is social construction. Because yeah, that's essentially what Butler is saying. There is no ontological meaning in sexuality, in sex, in gender. They're all constructions, right? So if we're applying this specifically to sexuality, then we're really leaning on Foucault, where he's like, discursive power creates sexuality. And Butler's like, well, and then it's perpetuated by performance, right? And to quote a very famous individual, the Honourable Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, shit happens. So that's how sexuality arises. It's shit happening. It doesn't exist as we'd say in philosophy a priori, so prior to anything else. Hello. Yeah. If you just joined the stream, you basically missed the explanation of performativity, but that's okay. We'll be talking more about it in where it works. So there are a lot of studies that essentially deal with, well, Honorable Tony Abbott. Yes. Yeah, so there's a lot of studies that deal with queer youth and online interactions, right? And especially with the advent of, modern social media, the modern web, right? There's a lot to unpack there. And using performativity as one of your lenses is going to be really useful because you can look at how the youth, right? They're going to be they're going to be performing different identities based on different contexts, and it just, like, queerness kind of proves, in a sense, or like provides good evidence for performativity being real. So specifically, there are a few studies here that are interesting. So the first one is dealing with MySpace, which is a very, very popular site, I've heard. And looking at how a bunch of queer youth in Europe kind of perform queerness through their posts, right? And so they're like using language, they're using symbols, right, to indicate their belonging to this group, right? And it's very interesting that this all occurs in a public space, right? Because other researchers have kind of found a different thing related to performativity, of course. So there's a study dealing with just broadly British. Sorry, unfortunately, it's British. Um, yes, the Facebook. We're getting to that actually. So this next study essentially dealt with a it dealt with a bunch of university students making that transition into university while being queer, right? And the study essentially found that in public spaces, these youth were less likely to actually perform queerness. They were going to, perform heterosexuality and, well, cisness, because of, well, society, because we do live in one. And due to anxieties that they felt, they did not want to publicly mark themselves. They didn't want to publicly perform queerness. And Facebook was a very, very bad example because, well, public by default sucks. Interestingly, the study was from like last year, Talbot et al. I have references at the end. Essentially, they found Tumblr was still pretty good, which I think is really interesting because Tumblr kind of got a little gutted. But anyway, um, the other like aspect of it is that we can look at, you know, how there's differences between men and women performing sexualities, and just challenging heteronormativity, right? So there was a study about 10 years ago, similar time period to the MySpace one actually, um, where this author, Fahs, she actually looked at compulsory bisexuality. And through this, like you can use performativity to analyze that and be like, okay, so sexuality is a performance. How does it differ? How is it actually performed? And yeah, there are gender differences in the performance of homosexuality and bisexuality. Yeah, compulsory bisexuality. So, um, given that there's interest, I'll actually expand on this. So, um, as I mentioned, Fahs 2009. It'll be in the reference list. She was really drawing on compulsory compulsory heterosexuality and lesbian existence, by Adrienne Rich, famous piece of literature, um, and kind of being like, okay, so we're in the modern world now. We're like 20 years divorced from Rich. What's changed about sexuality? And she looked at how women are often like pushed to perform uh homosexuality by men as like an aspect of the male gaze, but they still have to, exist within the male gaze, therefore kind of implying a compulsory bisexuality. Um, Conversely, she also looked at how men, uh, have this same performance of homosexuality, bisexuality as like a kind of like chicken game, where it's like, oh, jokingly trying to kiss other guys, and whoever like backs down first is the chicken kind of thing. But the idea is to not actually, you know, truly be homosexual, right? Um, Very interesting paper. Um, but yeah, it's compulsory bisexuality. Um, mm, it definitely is a big question mark, but it does make sense in the context of the paper. Um, all right, so yeah. Well, it's a term that exists. It's pretty cool. Um, of course, of course. Um, so now we're gonna take a look at these. I honestly don't know. Are they alpacas or llamas? I just I just got them from the PowerPoint stock images, but they're cute. So, um, yeah. Where does performativity have room for improvement? Alpacas, thank you. um, so there's a couple points where performativity could be improved or where it's lacking. So the first major one that multiple authors have kind of taken issue with, and in fact, Butler herself has actually kind of addressed this in Bodies That Matter, but I see. Okay. Um, so race within the framework of performativity. So essentially, the original like gender trouble uh book where Butler kind of elaborated on performativity and kind of developed it, right? She didn't really tackle race very much. Um, in performativity, it's really about the performance of gender and performance of sexuality. Yes, thank you. I do indeed be a variety channel. Um, so essentially, the racial element of gender was kind of unaddressed until Bodies That Matter. and Butler kind of was like, oh yeah, race exists. There are different uh, there are different ways to perform gender that's modulated by race, but we're not going to elaborate on it further because in performativity for like gender and sexuality, Butler talks of a thing called interpolation, which is to say there is some force pushing people into performing specific performances, I guess, or a specific gender or sexuality, right? And the example she uses for gender in specific is that of when you're born. The doctor's like, it's a girl or it's a boy. And then you're like, well, actually, I'm, 14, 15, 17, and yeah, I don't want to be what the doctor said I was because I'm not. And you're kind of still pushed into that performance because you've been interpolated into that performance. And society as a whole kind of has the mechanisms to push you into different boxes. Butler didn't really provide a more like thorough example of how race has interpolations, which is like initially performativity doesn't address it, and then in Gender Trouble, and then in Bodies That Matter, it's like introduced, but then it's like, well, yeah, it just kind of exists over there to the side. And oh yeah, by the way, I'm not going to give it the full treatment that gender and sexuality got. So it's kind of bad. Imagine intersectionality. Exactly. Um, there's actually an author, Milani, Swedish dude. He essentially is like, all right, I'm going to tackle like queering performativity, making it more intersectional, and looking at the perspective of the queer community in Israel, right? So if people aren't familiar with that, basically the Israeli government is trying to be like, look at us, we're like an island of queer rights in the Middle East, and it's like, are you really? And like there's activists that are like, okay, you're focusing on adoption and marriage, and that's like just normativity, right? That's heteronormativity because reproducing marriage as a queer person is just reproducing marriage, right? And that perspective of like, okay, well, in this context, right, in the West, we're like all about marriage, marriage, marriage. Over there, it's like, well, do all the people there actually want to take part in that institution? Or is their conception of queerness and their performance of queerness, is it different? Um, mm, yeah, it's it's in the references if you want to read the full thing. Also does an interesting thing at the end actually, where he's like, I'm not going to do an ending because endings are normative, so I'm just going to like summarize the key points of my paper. And it's like, my dude, that is in fact a normative ending. Even if you didn't title it conclusion, it's a conclusion. But yeah. Yeah. It's that there's a lot to unpack there. And in briefly mentioning it, I haven't really done it justice. But as I mentioned, there is further reading. Um yeah. So the next point that I'll raise, contrary to performativity, is the idea that um well, basically to suggest that interpolation is a thing, right? That you're pushed into performance suggests that the subject does not actually have agency, right? And that it's just the subject is some abstract thing that doesn't actually influence the performance and how it's modulated. And I will say, this was an early criticism, right? Like this is from the 90s, but I think it's relevant to bring up because it gets addressed later. Essentially, the idea is that, well, actually, there is some influence of the agent, of the subject, on performance, right? Because otherwise, how would queer youth take on different performances in different contexts, right? How would they choose that? And so that's kind of addressing that in a way where it's like, okay, yeah, performance is influenced. Related to this is biology. Biology is a big thing. In order to actually cite this, I had to reference a really fucking awful dude, because he had his grubby fingers in the paper. The other people in the paper were fine though. So basically, sexology exists, right? That is a field of study, and they try to use empirical measurements, empirical evidence. Thank you. It is in fact a big thing. Um, so sexology uses empirical data, right? They try to determine, okay, what is sexuality? Where does it come from? How does it arise? And so basically what the summary of the findings, which is why I had to use this paper in the first place, is that, well, yeah, there is some biological component there, right? Like, it's not just completely socially constructed. Because, well, yes, social constructivism is pretty based and can be applied broadly. Biology still has some influence, right? Like, and that's what research has found, right? Like, actually describing the interactions between people and all that, you kind of need sociology. But at an individual level, biology is still important, right? Which isn't to say that, like, oh, gay people are born gay people and there's no changing that, because sexuality is fluid throughout your life, right? Like, there definitely is, like, some component of it, right? Like, I, using myself as an example, right? I definitely felt changes in sexuality as biology changed. Like, that's just natural. But giving meaning to those changes is where sociology comes in, right? And God, I meant to be criticizing performativity, but here I am just being like, actually, no, it's still good. Um, but as I mentioned, I think performativity is pretty solid. I mean, with the exception of like the race aspect, but I think you can patch it. You can have the day one DLC where it's like, okay, we're going to go back to the drawing board. We have this core. We're going to bring in the thing that it's so obviously lacking. Um, but anyway, um, social constructivism more broadly has a lot of criticisms, and one of them is kind of related to race. So essentially, if you don't have materialist analysis in your like social constructivist theory, you're kind of missing out on like power relations and how uh everything matters. How, like, you're not getting the full meaning is what some authors say. And so yeah, like saying that, oh, gender is performance and sexuality is performance and blah blah blah, right? That doesn't take into account, okay, well, how does woman exist as an other to man? How is that a side of subjugation? How does homosexual exist as an other to heterosexuality? How is that a side of subjugation, right? And so broadly on social constructivism as a whole, you kind of have that issue of like, well, sometimes you need to bring in a wider analysis. And so the paper that I really used for this, their idea was like, okay, there are like 5 or 6 main strands of social constructivism. What if we combine them all and apply them where they work best to get the full picture? And yeah, that does kind of work, but Butler is based, so we're gonna stick with performativity. I should really explain what social constructivism is, shouldn't I? Because I'm sure that not everyone knows. So basically, social constructivism is like the idea that different things are like they arise from social interaction between people and groups of people, right? So, for example, performativity. Um, yeah. So performativity kind of falls under this bracket because it's saying that that sex, gender, sexuality don't naturally kind of have. Oh, thank you. All right, I'll address that in a sec after I finish kind of explaining. But yes, very good point. Um, okay. So formativity falls under social constructivism because it suggests that sex, gender, sexuality all arise, they all get given meaning from people interacting, people using them, right? And so that's what social constructivism is broadly. It's these things would not exist without society. Is the simple way of putting it. Yeah. So construction is not opposed to agency. It is the necessary scene of agency. The very terms in which agency is articulated and becomes culturally intelligible. Right. So the author I read criticizing that was like, okay, agency is like Butler's taking apart Enlightenment style agency and being like, it's all like constructed as well, and there's like some like hand. I'm not fully certain that I understand the really philosophical aspect of it, but that was my summary of the criticism. If you have anything else to add, Bento Scrub, I would love to tease it out some more. But yeah. All right. Next slide. Is actually questions and answers. So if anyone has like questions about this, just put them in the chat, and I'll hopefully try and answer. Yeah. So assuming people are typing questions, I'll just explain what Q&A. What is my favorite gender? Thank you. Okay. What is my favorite gender? So, all right. This is a hard one. I guess you know those like characters that are like just kind of passively non-binary and don't really have any like specifically gendered features and are just kind of like blobs. That's a good gender. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, good gender. Um, an example would be the main character of. Yes. Because gender is it's just not men. I mean, I don't like toxic masculinity as a performance. I don't particularly have an issue with men as a whole. So yeah, that's the thing. um, hmm. Any other questions that people have? Hmm. X-Men in particular. Yes. Oh hey, it me. I am X-Man. um. Hmm. Yeah. Speaking of men, though, Hamish McDonnell, former host of ABC's Q&A. Hmm. Do we have any Q&A watchers in the chat? Any aficionados of politicians getting asked questions on the ABC? Ah. All right. Well, I will give people another minute or two if they're typing, but I think yeah, that's that's performativity and sexuality. Hmm. And you can't read those. David Koch questions a riot. Yes. Um, clapping emojis. Thank you. Thank you. Um. Ooh. Okay, there we go. That's a question. Okay. Well, I would say that. Well, okay. So gender theory is academic. It's seen as like okay, upper class people that are learned, right? Well, I would say that kind of showing the wider public that actually, um, yeah, it's a great question. Um, Showing people that I guess in particular trans people, right, and gender nonconforming people, like we kind of have these discourses, and not everyone is like an academic, right? So showing people that hey, you only need to like learn a little bit. You don't have to go into academia and have a full like suite, like do a fucking course, a sociology course dealing with gender theory, queer theory, right? You can actually have summaries, right, of these theories and have these discourses without necessarily having them be academic discourses. Because like if we look at like discursive power, right? Gender, sexuality, etc., they're created through discourse, right? Just showing people that, um, ooh, yes. That's another good one. Um, so yeah, like mass media, um, kind of like normalizing these discourses through showing them just occurring and showing them naturally happening because people kind of naturally have discourses about gender, right? Like implicitly saying that, oh, you're such a girl if it's a person that's assumed to be male crying, right? Like that is inherently gender theory, right? Like that is gender theory in practice. It's, I mean, very essentialist, but it is happening. People are interacting with these without realizing. Um, yeah, that is the issue, right? Um, Mass media. God, speaking of mass media, actually, um, in Australia, one of the newspapers owned by uh democracy destabilizer Rupert Murdoch is the Herald Sun, right? And with regards to protests that are happening down here in Melbourne, right? They basically published an article that said, "Oh, nurses are going to join the construction workers and like tradespeople in protesting," even though the nursing union specifically put out a press release that said, "We condemn these protests. Please stop doing this. You are putting further strain on our health system." Right? Like that's who owns the mass media. And I guess, how do we do this? I I guess I'm trying to have a small part in introducing these discourses. I'll probably do more talks about like queer theory more broadly, as I like, you know, complete my degree. But I'm just one streamer. Um, I guess it shouldn't fall just on queer people. Like everyone that has the ability should kind of be contributing to these discourses, should be producing content that and having these discussions and introducing people to the idea that, hey, this isn't some academic, highfalutin, like abstract thing. This is a real down to earth thing that exists. Oh, yes. That is okay. Okay. Um all right. So, couple great points to address there. Um so I think, yeah, all right. I'm assuming Patrick's point is related. Uh yeah. Okay, okay. So I'll address Patrick's point first, then I'll move on to Bento Scrub. Um, so yeah, definitely like sneaking it into other media, um, is a way to get it through. There's actually a great example of performativity in action. I mean, Butler didn't agree at the time, but 1959 movie Some Like It Hot, essentially cross-dressing criminals that uh it's it's a thing. It's cross-dressing criminals that end up in relationships with men, and then it's played as of oh, the problem here is all these other tertiary things rather than the fact that it's a guy in a dress trying to get married to another guy. And that's kind of like the climax of the movie, right? Um, so that kind of discourse happened in Hays Code Hollywood, right? Like it was played off as a joke. Um, but that was a start. That can be a start to introducing these discourses into mass media. Um, and yeah, fully agree with Patrick on that one. Um, okay, gender theory across cultures. So I think a key part of that, um, personally, my like background is, well, from an Eastern European culture, which isn't as distant from the West as some other places would be. Um, I mean, colonialism kind of fucked everyone over, but yeah, um, it's like even in my country of heritage, let's put it that way. I don't want to dox myself. There's definitely a tension between like, oh, gay marriage is a thing that the dirty West is trying to import into us, right? So I kind of have a perspective on that. And so it's like you kind of have to use the tools that exist in the culture, right? You can't just be like, okay, we're going to apply performativity to everyone because Butler obviously didn't take into account every diverse culture that exists, right? Like you can use it as like a framework, but you shouldn't directly use it because you're going to hit that skepticism, as Bento Scrub mentioned. Um, and I think directly applying it to other cultures is, in a sense, neocolonialism, right? Like, having a unified theory of like everything. Nice. Yeah, like having a unified theory of everything would require a lot of different authors working together, and I doubt that one person could actually do it. One person could definitely do it about their own culture, building on work of other people, of course, as Butler did with, the Western conception of gender and sexuality, right? And I'm going to name drop this. I'm not going to actually explain it, but the heterosexual matrix, right? That doesn't necessarily apply in the same way to non-Western cultures, right? And so, yeah, I I think it can be a useful starting idea, but you can't just directly apply it. You have to build on what other people have talked about in that culture if you're going to be discussing that culture, because who's a better guide of that culture than person? Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. That's a very interesting point. That, yeah, Western gender norms have been pushed onto colonized peoples. Pedagogy of the oppressed. I think I've seen that mentioned before. Yeah. Um, God, there's so many random pieces of work that I just want to read eventually, but I just never get to it. But from what I've heard about that book, it definitely is important here, and maybe I'll read it and like try and summarize it on a stream. Who knows? But yeah, using the community's own practices against like the Western ideals, definitely a good way of doing it, and I fully agree. Um, yeah. How long is it anyway? I'm assuming it'd be like at least a few hundred pages. Yeah. Academic books tend to be like that. I'm like partway through Manufactured Consent by Chomsky myself, so I just can't be bothered finishing it. um hmm. All right. Um uh, citations have been up on screen for such a long time, but I'm assuming they're kind of hard to read. Ooh, is a documentary on manufactured consent. Nice. All right. I might watch that instead. Because Chomsky is like, the writing style is a bit dense and it make brain hurty. Yeah. All right. Um, I think this might be a decent point to leave off on. Um, unless people have more thoughts. Um, oh my god. Yeah. Chomsky got right by me. Uh, based on what I've read of Chomsky, I would unfortunately agree with that. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. um. All right. Well, I will put this VOD up on YouTube, and I'll include like all these like citate. Wait, I have to look that way. My monitor's actually over there with my citations, but on screen it's over there. Anyway, I'll put them in the description. I'll include other like bits of reading, um, that might be interesting. Um, definitely going to include Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So yeah, look forward to that. And thank you everyone for listening. I hope that this was an interesting stream and that you learned something. All right. Bye-bye.